Hello, welcome back to the Futurist New Deal podcast. I'm Johan Ben Zion, and I'm here with my friend George Wright, one of the leaders of the Technocracy Party, and I won't say the vice chair of the Technocracy Party because the Technocracy Party has had a little bit different organizational structure than some other organizations, and that's something that I believe we're going to be getting into a little bit. But I'm very pleased to meet this man with an awful lot of work and insight into this world of techno progress. How are you today, George?
I'm very fine, thank you.
Yes. Thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I've talked to yourself and Charmy, another leader of your organization, a few times, and it's great to hear your voice. And we're actually going to be talking about a documentary. And also showing some footage of from the technocracy organizations in this talk. But we're going to be talking about a documentary that you were working on about the history of the Technocracy Party and this very influential technocracy movement that shaped the course of the 20th century. Set that up for us a little bit, George.
Well, first of all, you can't we wouldn't want to call ourselves a party or vice president or anything like that. That supposes that we're intricate with the system that we know now. Yeah. And the system we know now...
Your organization is called Technocracy, Inc.
Incorporated, yes.
Yes.
We are a not-for-profit research and informational organization based on scientific function and control of the technological aspects of our continent.
Yes. I apologize that for using this shorthand. People are familiar with the term Technocracy Party, and I believe familiar with the term Technocracy Inc. I should perhaps not have been using those interchangeably.
No, that's understandable, and probably it won't harm anything as we go here, yes.
Very good, very good. So there's a little bit about Technical Alliance that we have discussed. And these inner workings go back quite some time. Tell us a little bit about the founding of your organization and how it became a real groundswell in certain parts of the 20th century.
Well, a gentleman called Howard Scott, who was an industrial engineer, helped with the division of resources for the home front during the First World War. And he noticed that it hasn't been often in history before that a country could field a major military enterprise and have very little effect on the domestic operation. And he realized then that it was because our technology reached a point where that was possible. And then he thought, too, that where is this going to lead? And this is about 1918.
Yes. And
how he came to meet with other people, we think of just their social aspects of meeting professionally, like they did with each other. That they got together and kind of discussed what this is kind of a new thing going on here, this technology. They got together and they thought it would be good enough, at least to start an organization to kind of look at this thing. So they banded together and they called themselves the Technical Alliance. And this was with educators and engineers, economists, doctor, architects, you name it, the full spectrum of a modern society. And eventually Howard Scott was elected to head things. And they ended up in Columbia University. They weren't associated with Columbia University, but they rented some, and this was during just as the Depression started. And there was a lot of unemployed engineers and researchers that they could use, and they hired them to do this research. The nucleus of the organization of these men lasted for a few years, but many stayed together, and they stayed at Columbia University, and it took about 11, 12 years of this research of the continent, that's North America, with the impact of technology on the upcoming future.
I want to stop you for a second because I want to put this in context, how different the world was in 1918 when Howard Scott founded this party. The Ottoman Empire still ruled a fair part of the world, The U.S. economy, the Dow Jones was literally a tiny fraction of what it was. There were not social safety net programs. There was no income tax at this time to speak of. And so it was a very, very different world. And this man had a very, very clear vision. We could call him a visionary in terms of what the 20th century held for us. And people like this, I think of something like the Green Party, not a perfect organization, but still something that's managed to very much shape the course of history in certain ways. And I think technocracy, the influence of technocracy, the Green Party pales by comparison in that regard. So we're now in the early 1920s at Columbia University. Sorry, continue with your story.
Yeah, it's good you point out that too, because you remember at that time most work was still being done, but primarily human and animal muscle power. But it was rapidly changing about that time. One thing, once you apply one tactical aspect to a situation, it kind of means that you go on from there, and it's kind of a snowball effect. And that was going on. And that's what Howard Scott said. Now, he thought an organization they founded knew that this continues on, it's going to wreak havoc with what we call a price system. That's any system that uses money or barter system, anything like that, basically. We call them a price system. They knew the North American price system, or United States price system in Canada, was big jeopardy because of this fact of using more and more technology that's going to displace the need for human animal labor. And what happens to the money system then? The depression, what in great part was caused because they'd already got to the point where they're producing more than they could be consumed. And down went the bridges. And there's more to all this, of course, but basically that's one of the things that's happening. And Howard Scott saw that. Then there was kind of a lax of kind of an impasse of interest, and all of a sudden they're still at Columbia. All of a sudden, some reporter or from a newspaper got a hold of their information, the design that they created, and started putting out kind of like stuff that wasn't accurate. So about that time, a renowned he was Howard. Let's see. M. King Hubbard, a geologist, preeminent geologist for the United States oil industry, saw this information, and he also thought, what's going to happen here? So he and Scott, he found Scott, and they, to make a long story short, they figured something has to be done about this, controlling this lack of accurate information. So they went to New York and formed the organization of Technocracy Incorporated, based on the research that the Tech Alliance did. But
Very nice.
That's how we created Technocracy Incorporated. And that was about 1933, I think. Yeah.
Yes. And we could say that in the years between 1929 and 1935, the Technocracy Party and Technocracy Incorporated was poised to sweep across the nation. And then there were other set of reforms that reshaped some of that energy that were everyone is quite familiar with the history of the New Deal and the Great Depression. I mean, maybe people who watch Fox News get those things confused. But I want to actually shift gears from one of our to one talking point that we didn't get to, which is a gentleman who I very much admire, R. Buckminster Fuller. Now, people in my organization, I imagine many of them are familiar with Howard Scott, but Buckminster Fuller is a guy who people also draw a lot of inspiration from. His concepts around advanced technology, around technocracy, around his perhaps most famous of quotes, the ability to do more and more with less and less. These ephemeralization concepts. In some ways, this is a story of the 20th century, and yet human development and quality of life is not commensurate with those increases in productivity. How do you feel about those concerns about our struggling middle class? How does Technocracy Incorporated hope to address those concerns?
Well, we're getting a little ahead of the subject here, but basically,
Yes.
The organization grew tremendously during that time you're talking about because people didn't know where the next meal was coming from.
Yes.
And it looks to me like that the only time you get any kind of a movement like that would accept something like technocracy is that people lose their comfort zones. So this appealed. Of course, you had communism was being, talked about on the street corner, along with fascism and socialism, you name it, and all of our domestic political agenda and all that stuff was all going on at the same time. But technocracy got to be the fastest growing social movement of all because it made sense. It was based on science and fact, and what brought about there was a time when it got too advanced when Howard Scott made what they call a Hotel Pierre address. That was in 1933 also, I think. I'm not sure. He went to, and this, a lot of the, what we call the establishment now was thinking they could use technocracy for their own advantage, and also other advocates of a social change thought, what is this about technocracy? When he explained that business and the business enterprise and politics will no longer be required because of the technical aspect of this and of the functional design that displaces any need for that type of control. It's control of science and technique as opposed to political representation and that sort of thing. Yes.
Let's put this in context. This was a speech that was given at a conference. It was also a national radio broadcast.
This was a national,
that went out to
yes,
the
right.
entire country, January 13th, 1933, and it was describing a controversial. We mentioned that in a certain sense, a marketplace of ideas was more open at that time. A lot of people were communists. The far right movement didn't have the same associations with genocides and wars in Europe that it has today at this time. So there was a lot of different attitudes about coming from these different camps. But this set of ideas that were proposed by the Technocracy Party at this time represented significant changes to the operations of governance and economic theory that you have alluded to. And this shook people to their core, as I believe you said to me before. Please continue. Tell us more about this.
It shook, like you say, it shook people to the core, especially what we call the establishment. And one of the main owners of the establishment, or belonging to the establishment, was a fellow named Randolph Hearst, William Randolph Hearst, who had
very famous,
who had probably the biggest media conglomerate in the United States at that time.
Yes, Citizen Kane.
Yes, right. He put a memo out to all of his holdings, all of his different newspapers around the country, to never ever mention technocracy in anything again. Don't allude to it. Just no discussion, anything about that. Which put, we have a ledger in our barn. We call the barn our storage area. It's a big, thick thing. It's probably maybe 10 inches thick or more. It's big. It takes up a whole table almost. And there's all kinds of newspapers clippings starting way back, probably in 1930 right up until Hearst put this pronouncement in it. And then there's very few. It was quite effective. Well, Scott said then we got to do our own publication. That's when the sections, what we call the sections, the organizations throughout the country and Canada, started bringing new members, and a lot of these people were gifted in various aspects of their lives, and they actually started magazines and what do you call brief productions and speakers of all kinds. And it was really something else to behold. You can't imagine in that time of our life what this organization really did. But yeah, they started their own information outlets, and it was effective until probably 1939, 1940, when the United States started to produce things for the beginning of the Second World War, helping England out with the Lend-Lease program, for instance. And then we got into the war. Well, people got their jobs back because of the war, and then interest faded out to that. But the organization kept going, and we're still here today, still trying to put out this information that we have got to change our way. What we're doing to ourselves is not sustainable.
And, I think that it's fair to describe Technocracy Party and Technocracy Incorporated as a sleeping giant. And I will tell you why this is the case, in my view, because we are now on the verge of making those kinds of changes to governance and to economic systems more broadly, that would be directly resulting from advanced algorithms and post-industrial effects on the order of ultimately full automation. It's often been said that planned economies had they had an organization like Amazon.com, a highly automated, advanced algorithm-run organization. Amazon has the capitalization of a huge country, Australia, and it has the employees of a small town. And the reason that this incredible functioning that they have is a result of one of the most automated and algorithm-run operations in history. We're able to increasingly be having things delivered to our home via drone and things like this. This kind of operation could very well allow for the rebirth of these kind of changes. And this is why I wanted to talk to you, because people in our organization are very interested in this. People in your organization are interested in moving all of these things into the 21st century as well. And so I'm so pleased to be talking about this history and maybe building bridges to a 21st century technical alliance. We've had a few conversations along these lines. I regard you and Charmy as friends of mine and as friends of the Futurist New Deal. So again, I thank you for speaking to me on this. Let's talk more about the rest of the 20th century, continuing with the background of Technocracy Inc.
Well, to look at the future, you might want to go back a bit. There was a guy named Bellamy that wrote a book called Looking Backward. And in that book, he kind of describes a distribution center, something like Amazon.com, I guess, is today. But the feel that he had the same thing. He could see kind of a solution how this should go about. So if people are interested in get that book and read that. I found it very interesting too.
It's a utopian novel that influenced a lot of people's thinking in the 1800s, the late 1800s, on ideas around modernity and like some other writers of that time, Jules Verne comes to mind. Really shaped people's ideas about what would be possible with automation and technocracy, even in those early days.
Well, science. There's been a concerted effort to discredit science from the political structure for a long time now. It's been almost a swear word in certain aspects. Matter of fact, the Trump administration right now is moving the federal Department of Agriculture and another agency from Washington, D.C. to Kansas City. And they're going to lose half of their people because they can't move. And that department was responsible for research and development and ideas of how best to go about using our land for agriculture, and et cetera, and water reclamation, that sort of thing. They're there again. To them, science is anti. They're against science. And yet that we depend on science for our lives now, basically. We can't go back.
And it bears repeating something that you alluded to before. That level of efficiency, those level of ripple effects throughout institutions, when we have the political will and the foresight and initiative to pursue those kind of better run institutions, run on efficient principles, engineering and scientific principles, we see benefits to our society. We have seen the opposite in the United States in the last 4 decades because of a wrong kind of, for lack of a better word, corporatocracy, one that doesn't concern itself with improving the efficiency or quality of life in these areas. And that is an excellent example. This lack of concern for having well-run organizations and just incoherent political strategies on the part of people in the Trump administration. But this goes back some decades. This lack of insight into how these organizations would best be run.
Yeah, I didn't mean to minimize that with Trump. It has been going on for quite a while. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Trump is a boogeyman, but he's not the boogeyman, in my view. I think that organizations like yours put a good exclamation point on that because those contrasts are so significant.
Yes. Yep.
So let's returning to our discussions. How is the Technocracy Incorporated and the Technocracy Party affected by later developments around the New Deal, around the Second World War? Speak of that as much or as little as you like.
Well, it was still a growing organization even during the Second World War, basically. Matter of fact, several members of the Technical Alliance were called upon by the Roosevelt administration to sit on the boards to help with the war effort, which was significant, showing that these people really had the credentials.
Yeah, it's fair to say that the Technocracy Movement, to some degree, was incorporated into that brain trust, that cabinet of FDR. So it's not the only narrative to say that the future. The New Deal was in competition with the technocracy organizations. There's also quite a bit of convergence there.
Well, all your members in technocracy, including the members from the Technical Alliance, then into the technocracy, they're as patriotic as anybody. They wanted the United States to be a good place to live and good place to operate, and so that's why they put themselves forward. But. I mentioned before of the geologist. His name keeps escaping me. M. King Hubbard. He was put on the board to help with coordinating some of the efforts of where and how much stuff we have to work with, and et cetera, and where it is, and that sort of thing. But he was called before some kind of a Washington, D.C. Investigation of his activities with Technocracy Incorporated, and they determined that he was not a viable candidate for that job, and he was dismissed. So there again, when Technocracy's name come up with something like that, it was put down quickly. Yeah.
And I've been talking to quite a few people about concepts in digital democracy, liquid democracy, digitalization of government services, ultimately decentralization of the institutions, some of which is very much in a sort of libertarian vein in the longer term. How do you see technocracy in the 21st century interacting with some of those developments? Do you have a different feeling about the future of technocracy than you did in previous decades today?
My feeling about the organization and what it's all about and what it wants for itself to be known by more and more people, that's still with me. But when I look and see what's happening to our planet, to the efforts to try to dismiss any kind of real change that is required, I don't know what kind of a future we can look forward to. We're just here to keep this idea alive, basically. And if we go down swinging, that's the way it goes. But the Seattle Times had a couple of interesting articles just this week. The first one was that a quarter of the world's population will be running out of water. The water shortage now, but in some years ahead, they'll be running out of water. And then just today, and I saw it was on one of the TV programs about the food food supplies, same thing. We're damaging so much of the soil, and disregarding what the pollution's doing and environmental impact, that the food source is in the same predicament.
Yes, and we've as a global civilization, we've made strides. There were many billions of people, 3 billion people in the world just around 3 decades ago who did not have access to potable water or food. Those numbers are now under 1 billion, and that is owing to some kind of techno progress in nearly every respect. But we run the risk of reversing this good work that we have done by not addressing these concerns. And contemporary technocratic principles can affect these supply chain concerns and these inequality concerns in very real ways.
Well, there's 2 caveats that the price system has to have in order for it to survive. And that means continual expansion and scarcity conditions. And technology changes all that for them. And that's what they're trying to do, is keep expansion going. Now when I was in high school, we had about 150 million people in the United States. Now we got, 370, something like that. And the world population at that time was about 3 billion. Now it's almost 8 billion. That's your expansion for you there. But as you increase the expansion methods, you increase the need for stuff to keep people alive, keep them fed, keep them housed, and this planet is finite. There's only so much to go around for everybody, and in some aspects we are now reaching limits on that because of the need for expansion.
And it brings to mind something, and I almost. In preparing for this interview, I almost did not want to mention this, but it is a turn of phrase that is well known among people in techno-optimist circles, and that is, and I think it relates directly to some of the kinds of changes that you're suggesting here, the notion of fully automated luxury communism. And I don't have any great and abiding love of planned economies or communism particularly, but this idea, it's a little, putting the way that people use communism in this term, it's sometimes a little tongue-in-cheek. But this worldview, which is shared by some people in the techno-optimist community to a higher degree, it describes some of the changes that you would describe there to the running of economic institutions and government institutions. We all know that money, it's not a real thing. It is a product of our imaginations and collective cooperation, social contract therein, and it's a product of the operations of nation states that we have sophisticated financial institutions today. And there's a lot of ways in which those things can be tweaked and improved. And in a sort of in a country that can have so many advanced algorithms running organizations of questionable value, a lot of what happens in the world of Silicon Valley, it's a lot of fluff. It's entertainment, and it has value on in the marketplace. Its value to human development, some of it is more questionable. But this concept of fully automated society, and I think it dovetails pretty well with the ideas from the Technocracy Party moving into the 21st century. Is there anything in that that you would take exception to?
Not exception to, but I would say that I don't think we'll ever be fully automated, because we need the human touch. We need the social aspect of people getting together. But it doesn't necessarily have to be in a job situation or a fraternal organization or something. But as we go through life, if you could think about where all your major needs are automatically taken care of, that opens up the whole spectrum of a life that's just unheard of in the present situation.
And just this morning, I spoke to a man named David Wood, really one of the great founders of our transhumanist organizations, And, we touched upon some of these things. He's not as much of a techno-singularitarian, this idea that technology is advancing at a quicker and quicker pace, and that will create changes to these kinds of institutions that have never been seen before. He's not as much of a singularitarian as some of the people I've interviewed, but he does hold to those ideas. And it's an idea of great interest to people in our community, as I believe applying these engineering principles, which is a more sound idea. There's some metaphysical notions that start to enter in a discussion when you're talking about a change that is beyond what people can imagine. It gets into a little bit of a magical thinking set of circumstances, which I try to resist by talking about near-term policy initiatives and the most likely of technological developments and prototypes that we will see in the near term.
Politics and business are just interference now. It's just interference trying to hold on to the old order. And if I may, I'd like to quote a statement here by Howard Scott in one of our booklets called Science versus Chaos. And it's one paragraph, and his quote: "The scientists, technologists, and engineers of this continent are the general staff of the technate," which we call the eventual technocracy, the technate of American, whether they like it or not. "By their work ye shall know them, and the technicians of all branches have produced the works that are bringing about the demise of the price system." Well, the role has always been to inform people that there is an alternative to the destructive methods we've been experiencing for forever almost, the price system. Basically, since we've had now the advent of technology to come on to help us do things, we have a chance to use that where it benefits most people, as many people as possible, if we use it correctly. We're not using it correctly. We're still living in a price system where the surge of what we want to do in everyday life is to better ourselves individually and make as much money in our job as possible. And we don't really have that much cooperation among ourselves or even other countries when you have always that as a prime concern. That's why we have wars, basically, and attempts to cheat other people out of their funds so we can have more. It puts the dynamics of a human being and emotional levels on the negative, where it exemplifies our greed and desire to take things, whether we think we need them or not. If we use the technology correctly, where we can benefit by producing goods and services enough for everybody to go around, that will lessen that very, very much. And basically, how do we do that? Well, a long time ago, it was figured out the best way to do that is to start from the beginning. What creates everything that every human being has to have to exist, and that is the energy it takes to do everything. Everything we do, use, and consume takes a certain amount of energy. And the North American continent, at one time at least, was blessed with a plethora of energy resources. And the idea then was to take a survey of what's out there that we can convert into energy devices to get things done. And then, first of all, what does a society need to keep going for itself? We need an educational system, we need transportation, we need food services, we need infrastructure, we need all these things that a modern society needs to keep going. And then we figure out how much energy is available and how much of that energy does it take to do all these sorts of things that we just talked about. And then what's left over goes to us as individuals to use at our convenience. And being as most of us already been accounted for, in like the educational system, transportation, medical, it's already been accounted for. What's left over for our own personal use would be very minimal. So that was called from the Technical Alliance, their research, and transferred into Technocracy Incorporated a few years later. So what is the future? Why did this not become better known? I asked that question when I first became aware of technocracy. How come I haven't heard of this? Well, because we're living in a price system. Of course, you want to protect your interests. And when the idea took off during the Depression, there was a lot of what I call the establishment, I guess, for lack of a better word. The establishment wanted no part of this because it ruined their chance of their continuing making profits. So the word was out that the modern media at that time, headed by William Hearst, and all followed suit, that they would no longer talk about technocracy in any of their outlets. And to this day, it kind of holds. And we've been conned into thinking that the United States is the greatest Western civilization the world has ever known, when in fact our very lives depend on us in warfare. We have become a warfare welfare state, basically. But now, about 40 to 45% of taxes right off the top goes to support the military. And what's left over, gosh, these are just a few prime examples. But the future, you want to talk about...
And very little of that military spending is spent on personnel. An awful lot of, tens of trillions of it have just been lost.
That's a good point. Most of it goes in, a lot of it goes into research on how best to kill other people. Yeah. That's what military is about, Yeah, well, but the future though, the future is we do keep active the few of us that remain. There's not many of us anymore. There are a lot of people that are interested, and we hear about them, we talk to them a little bit like yourself. And we have a website that they can tune into and read more about what's going on, and what the idea then is we are contacting people. The only way this will ever work is if enough people understand what's really behind our problems and want to fix it. That is, we have a hope for that. But there's no guarantee that this is going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but even though some of those efforts have changed and those organizational structures have changed, there's a very real sense in which the 20th century was shaped just in the way that it was shaped by Fabian socialism, that the developed world is now basically a Fabian socialist world, and they had people in the earliest conceptions of those ideas, they would view the world that we are living in the developed world as a kind of paradise relative to what their outcomes. You can say the same thing about technocracy. Technocracy has affected the way that governments are run to a great deal. Not nearly so well as it should be. Particularly here in the United States, as you mentioned, there's that kind of zero-sum thinking. There's that kind of corporatism and wrong-headed approaches to economic policy, and it's why even conservative economists, people like Milton Friedman, were in favor of things like a negative income tax or basic income, because allowing everyone to participate more fully in the economy, setting the stage for that via economic reforms, it adds a lot of value. It makes and it takes away a lot of negative effects, a lot of hidden costs. There's tremendous hidden costs to people being poor and having economic insecurity.
Well, part of the driving force too that causes these problems too is because of the very use of that technology. If even as a technocrat and I own a small business or something, what's the biggest expense that most businesses have? It's labor. So you're always trying to cut down on your expenses, so you're looking for ways to decrease your labor costs. And yet labor, that is the primary working horse of the price system. It goes back centuries ago where most of the energy being used at that time was primary human and animal. Well, we transferred way out of that now. So we've got all kinds of systems to try to keep this thing going, like planned obsolescence, outright welfare.
It's a horror.
Yeah. Yes.
Planned obsolescence is one of the biggest failings of, there's a very real sense in which we might not have a climate crisis had we not indulged in such things.
Yes, of course. And when we become, it's a wasteful, terrifically wasteful thing. Look at the ocean so full of plastics now. We've known plastics were a problem. yet we continue to use them and use them more and more. And now we've got species dying because, like some of the orcas and other animals out in the ocean that depend on other animals for their food, they're finding not only do they have all kinds of contaminants in their body from residue of toxins and so forth that come in the water systems, but they're full of plastics. There's just so much plastic in the ocean now. I saw just the last few days I've been watching like 60 Minutes had quite an effort. Some fellow was trying to gather plastic, big netting type thing they had out there. It wasn't quite successful, but at least they're trying to do something. But have we gone too far? Can we even correct what we've done to damage the world as such? I don't know.
Yeah, I actually know, not a good friend, but I know a scientist who developed this a bioremediation effort. That it's basically a microbe that has a biomechanical element. So it has sort of a mechanical thing added to this a small organism, and its function is also to be cleaning up a specific kind of oceanic toxin. So there are things that people are doing along these lines, but it is a very real question. How much have we damaged the ecosystem beyond repair? We hope we can hope for the best, but we have to do better than that, and we have to change the way that we have to have real oversight. We don't, the United States is the U.S. military itself as an organization is the largest polluter in history. And we have so many other large organizations here, corporations that are responsible for that, and not having any. They have virtually no accountability. In many cases, many features are self-regulated, and that's we have to take these organizations to account. There's a study that said that if these guys actually were doing the right thing in terms of environmental policy, if they weren't just defraying costs by dumping toxins into the water in secret and so forth, if they were actually having to dispose of that, almost no companies of the 20th century model would have been economically viable.
Yeah.
They were only economically viable because they were cheating at a great human and environmental cost.
Well, as we go through the countdown and all these problems we're faced with, and all the types of activity that we're going through for the negative aspects to it, very damaging, very toxic. The problem is not so much that, is the system itself. It's the system itself. We have to change the way we operate. And people don't want to leave their comfort zones. As long as we're halfway happy and we're still voting for politicians and get ended up with people like Mr. Trump and so forth, nothing's going to get done. Nothing will get done.
Yeah. And I do believe that had we had technocrats at the helm, had we had this, we wouldn't have these clowns, and we wouldn't have these same set of problems. We would be having, and you don't have to be, a hardline green to be doing better than what we've done in the course of the 20th century. At the genesis of your organization, there wasn't really that sensibility anywhere. That there was other kinds of eco concerns with the Audubon Society and Theodore Roosevelt kind of working together, but there wasn't the same kind of green culture that there is today. But I think that is a natural side effect, some responsibility when you're working from results-oriented metrics, when you're working from a deep respect of scientism, and so forth. And that's not reflected in our country. It's to varying degrees reflected a little bit better in other countries, but we need. Do you feel that? Do you think it's a fair statement to say that China is the closest iteration of a 21st century technocracy today, or do you take exception to that kind of?
Oh, exception, of course. Yes.
I mean, aside from the concerns about the theories of governance, left or right, they do have the way that their institutions are managed, and they have governors and mayors are appointed, and they're only appointed on the basis of having had success with those metrics, and that's basically the engine of the great Chinese growth that's been. So they're not a true technocracy, but they have in some ways implemented technocratic institutions beyond that of other nations, in my view. What in what ways do you feel that a state like that is not a technocracy?
No, because they're still chasing the buck, or the yuan, or they call it a currency. That's what it's about. Like I said before, every blasted problem you can think of, just follow the money. Until you get out of that and get into energy conversion accounting system, energy accounting, like I mentioned earlier, until you get to that stage, will nothing change.
Yeah.
And why give China one credit for what they realized that they had way too many people, so they tried to institute some kind of a population control but that backfired too. But they started killing off all the females, and because sons were valuable in their families more so than women.
Have an imbalance.
Yeah. That was a terrible episode there.
Yeah. There's an awful lot of things that we can point to in China as being mismanaged. I don't mean to suggest that they are a paragon, but in terms of certain approaches to development and human development in these areas, they do have a more sound approach, at least than the United States, and as a result, they don't have a military-industrial complex. It's just losing tens of trillions of dollars under the couch cushions. Insofar as they have those efforts, there's civil engineering efforts and human and things that contribute more directly to human development. So how do you see things like blockchain technology, advanced technologies that are more digitalized and distributed, decentralized? How do you see those contributing to the viability of this post-money initiative that you would support, things like energy accounting?
I don't quite understand the question there, but and I don't really. This whole idea of what we're just talking about here is a concept, and as we get into it, of course, things will have to be accounted for the changes taking place. We don't have the excess resources that we used to have right here on our continent anymore, for one thing. Mm-hmm. And actually, the Technical Alliance came up with a continental hydrology, which included a canal type system, because transporting things by water takes the least amount of energy. And so they figured a canal system, and they had dams and locks and all things figured, but it wasn't practical because they didn't really have enough of the engineering ability to really do the fine work on it. But the concept was great, and it included irrigation and flood control and even moderate climate change, basically. And it was a great concept, but it would have to be wholly researched now. But the concept is great there, because North America is really blessed with the river system falling north and south, basically, and a lot of. But the Corps of Engineers had changed so much of that structure too, just to make it more economically feasible. In other words, cheaper for businesses to operate. Not thinking so much about the ecological concept that should be included, along with these other things we're talking about. It still all boils down to the money system.
Yes, and it's interesting, that we were speaking of China a moment before. They had prior to a certain kind of economic liberalization push on the part of their leadership to be more capitalist. They had a system that was not aligned, but a parallel to the kind of reforms that you're talking about to the price system. It's very possible that they could swing back in that direction as opinion and leadership changes again.
Well, if we could magically go, let's say we are under a technocracy. You're in a functional design setup now here. You would not recognize anything that we can think about right now. Nothing would be the same. Well,
yeah, it would certainly be. It's one of the easier ways conceive of such a thing is in the form of a highly automated smart city that has those civil engineering products and outcomes that you described. Urban planners have been working from such designs for a while, and smart cities haven't developed in the way that they promised to in the early 90s, but we can still see those things in our near future, particularly as other technologies advance so quickly. Other forms of advanced algorithms and digitalization that would allow to make it easier to implement larger scale projects.
Yes, all that's very, very possible, if that's true. But the thing of it is, though, you're still living in, I keep referring back to the price system, where actually it needs, I think I mentioned earlier, it needs two things for it to survive, and that is scarcity conditions and room for expansion. Now, one thing that the world really hasn't talked too much about is that the need for expansion was taken up with the increased population. You need more people to consume things, so I guess have more. But the trouble is, we only have one planet, and it's only got so much stuff, and you keep wanting to consume more and more and more. Eventually, you run into some real problems there, and that's another thing we're running into now. There's just too darn many people on this planet. And the scarcity thing, of course, when you apply more and more technology, you have no more need for that old human muscle or the little oxen. It just there goes your scarcity concept too, and that's they're always trying to get around this by one way or another, and that's by printing more money. It's one of the big ones. What is our total debt now? I wonder.
It's gone up by the many trillions just in the course of this administration. And that's, there's, it's interesting, a moment ago you were talking about, what were we talking about? I lost the thread.
That's okay. There's plenty of other things we talk about,
we were talking about a post-scarcity concept, and that's something that's very near and dear to transhumanists, many of us. Certainly.
What do you mean by post-scarcity?
So we are moving into a world where there's potentially a lot more robotization and more importantly, advanced algorithms that can do the work of human beings, and that creates problems. Creates problems in the marketplace. But that sets a stage for potentially for changes in economic models, dramatic changes potentially, and also it sets the stages for dramatic changes in governance, more decentralized governance, ultimately adhocracy, a sort of voluntarist governance that people could participate in and would be self-sustaining because we have. Because the man hours are costing pennies on the dollar because those man hours derive from advanced algorithms that can do the work of human beings.
Another factor, along with what you describe as post-scarcity, is our weather patterns are changing, and back in the Midwest there, that they've had to postpone their plantings because of so much floods they couldn't plant, and what they did finally plant, there's going to be so much less of it. So we're running into that problem too because we've so damaged the ability to the Earth to recharge itself under conditions that's good for human habitation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this derives from a particular form of capitalism, and as you said, it's a natural feature of capitalism in general. But the United States has a more egregious form of this kind of vulture capitalism and basically completely unregulated. Corporatism, and we are going to have to face the music on that, and it could represent a terrible loss of life and disruption to many things. You mentioned that we have a couple of problems with consumerism. And some of those things are changing. Every every day almost you see an article in a mainstream a news magazine or soft news magazine saying that millennials, by not being the same kind of consumers that their predecessors were, that these quote-unquote millennials are destroying this business. The millennials are destroying this business model or that business model by not being the same kind of consumers. And of course, that's a feature of them not having the resources that previous generations had. You know, there's no, just people don't earn as much money as they used to. So some of those things are changing. Even the what you mentioned in the vein of the Malthusian dilemma, that is becoming something where as countries become fully modernized and participants in the developed world, those birth rates go down to slightly below replacement. So if we had a fully modernized world, like in a full automation framework, we would also have birth rates globally decreasing. So maybe we don't have to we don't have to stipulate for that, but we do have to change a lot of the ways that we approach what human development is and what a good economics are.
Yeah, one of the things too that you know that we as a people, as a species in this part of the world, the United States and Canada and North America, we're not apprised of what the real problems are if they're hidden from us. They don't want to talk about it because talking about it would mean we have to change somehow, and that's why you end up with Newark, New Jersey, with their lead in their water so badly, because we haven't kept up with the changes needed in infrastructure for whatever reasons, you know.
Yeah. There's that lack of interest in infrastructure on the part of our society and the part of our so-called leaders. That is a key distinction. That is a key difference that you would see in a technocratic.
Exactly.
Nation.
Yep.
Fixing those problems would be at the top of the list. Creating a better society for all concerned would be at the top of the list, and that's something that is very much in keeping with the vision that Howard Scott and those early founders of this movement had. It was a pleasure to speak to your friend Howard.
Yes, he's amazing, isn't he?
Yeah. It was just nice to be able to get that background. Going back into those times, you know, I was born more recently, but I've always really enjoyed this the history aspects of these kind of conversations as well. So it was really nice to get a full range of ideas and background on that as well. So I thank you for that. Is there anything else that you'd like to remark upon in the discussion of the history of this organization, in this discussion of these other implementations for 21st century Technate?
I suppose it was inevitable that we would find the type of constrictions against our promoting this idea in the first place, because in a money system, the money is the power, and of course they had avenues of approaches that they could keep any kind of dissension down, basically, and learn like we would not have heard of technocracy if it hadn't been for the Depression. Things were bad enough so that the power elite, the establishment, lost control there, and by certain things that the Roosevelt administration did, plus the Second World War came around, it got money back in people's hands, and so the pressure for change was then diminished. But you keep referring about the future. I don't know anybody can really talk about the future in a given type of certainty. We really don't know. We do know though that changes will occur to make us do something, whether we have enough time or not. I think that's the big question now.
Very nice, very nice. Well, thank you for speaking with me again. It's always a pleasure, George Wright, and I value your insights. I'd like to think of Technocracy Inc. and the Futurist New Deal as on some kind of parallel trajectories in terms of these kind of reforms, these kind of sea changes that we want to see happening around technology and policy and human development. And I hope that we can continue to be speaking with yourself and people in your organization to that.
Well, yeah, it's been my pleasure too. It's been a long time since I've actually had opportunity to talk like this to anybody that's with an interest outside of technocracy. It's just great.